Is this tape recorder working? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Is it working? Test it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Testing, testing, testing. Let me just make sure, just say a word and we'll see
Okay,
if we
yeah, I'm
can
just,
hear.
I was talking about,
I've never seen it.
I read in the column yesterday that Garrison Keeley at the New York, I love him. He's the guy that did
Okay.
the,
Yeah.
the radio show out of Minnesota.
Yes. Yeah.
I listened to it every Saturday night for 4 years in Texas.
Very funny.
Yeah, terrific. I just love his stuff. Someone just sent me a second book. I have to read it. Well, I was talking about Joe, I guess. W- I was, I was never, no one's ever happy with what is written about him, I'm sure. But very often I had been treated at least with fairness up until the day the book was published. And boy, from that day on, I'm talking about reporters. You build up a rapport sometimes over a long case. They would take things on my lawyer's word or my word after a while, knowing that we weren't trying to flim flam them. And if they checked the sources, it always came out that way. So every once in a while, when there was like a questionable little thing, we would at least get the benefit of the doubt. They would always give at least both sides. We would never get purely hammered, by one side or one-sided story. But boy, in September of 1983, that screeched to a halt, and it was the strangest phenomenon. Reporters that had followed the case for 5 or 6 years and knew a lot of the background, um, the reaction to me was 180 degrees different from the day that book was published. It was like, well, gee, Joe's a journalist and I'm a journalist and he says that and God, there must be something to it. And it was awful to try to deal with it. I mean, very professional people from Newsday and the AMA News and AP. And so we're very suspicious. And, this whole episode with William Buckley and Joe Wambach really left a sour taste. Watching Firing Line and reading the transcripts of the Firing Line show and whatnot, that's just an awful thing that they're doing. They're setting up a very one-sided monologue and calling it a dialogue on national TV.
I agree. That did seem very unfair not to have somebody from your
Unfair. They
side
didn't
on it.
even say. They didn't even tell the viewer that Floyd Abrams is NBC's lawyer.
Yeah.
NBC is Fatal Vision, and there was a big to-do.
Did they offer a
Nothing.
right to come? Because it would have been more interesting if they
Of
did
course,
that.
and it would have been much more ethical.
Yeah.
And I think it would have been much more honest. Floyd Abrams was. I'm not saying he intentionally did it, but I think Buckley and McGinnis were intentionally allowing the feeling to come across that he was a neutral expert on First Amendment rights. That isn't his role at all. He was NBC's lawyer as we were trying to get NBC to be fair in the initial script for Fatal Vision. We were in great contact and in lengthy contact with NBC prior to the airing of that show. And we tried to do several things. I think the main thing we wanted was to have the facts on the show that was eventually aired accurate. Well, they wouldn't listen to our input, so then we tried to get them not to put the show on, but of course that never worked. That's the prior restraint problem. And they just love to hear you say that. They love the argument in the press. Susan Baerwald, the vice president for NBC, made those awful statements that she always makes. She just made it about the Billionaire Boys Club, or is that the one that she? No, I'm not sure that was the one she. I'm sorry, she may not have been quoted on that, but she was saying to the press while we were trying to stop the showing of Fatal Vision, or at least making it accurate, that they had double checked every fact in the script, and it was absolutely accurate. I mean, that script is so filled with factual inaccuracies that it's beyond your wildest imagination. And it's just very frustrating. I mean, you're fighting this terrible bureaucracy, and they just keep sitting there holier than thou saying, well, he's in prison, and we've checked our sources, and it's accurate, and it's going on the air. And it just snowballed from the day that Fatal Vision published, so that we have a hard time getting heard neutrally at all. I mean, it's a terrible feeling to talk to someone, have what you think is like a decent response. They've asked you what seem to be open questions. You give a detailed answer with documentation, and a day later or a week later or a month later, in some cases, what comes out is purely McGinnis's version with all of the facts excised from our argument, and simply MacDonald or one of his attorneys in a statement that's not a factual statement. It's more like a sense of where we're going or something like that. It's just a terrible position to be in. The LA Times Tuesday is a great example. I mean, that reporter sat there and watched that trial. That reporter knows that our arguments were factual. They were based in real witnesses who were on the stand. There are documents to back it up. There are letters from Joe McGinnis. She didn't even mention that McGinnis stole money from me. How can you settle a lawsuit for $325,000 based on fraud and breach of contract and never mention one of the three legs of the fraud and the breach of contract? I mean, I read it and I kept thinking, well, wait a minute, what does Gary Bostwick have to say? There's not a single word from my attorney. Not a single word.
I've been talking to Gary, and I didn't ask him whether he had been approached. Perhaps he didn't want to speak to them, or did they approach?
He was standing right there talking to him as I was leaving the courthouse.
I was struck by that there was not a quote from.
That is exactly what's been happening to me. So they have these lengthy quotes from John Sturgeon, who it turns out is not only Joe McGinnis's new lawyer in Los Angeles, but Joe Wambaugh's lawyer. And it's this old boy network. But in any case, they have no quotes from Gary. They have nothing about the money that McGinnis withheld from me that I was rightfully due by a written contract with him. There's no question about that. The jury knows it. The judge knew it. Both sets of lawyers knew it. And McGinnis got on the stand and admitted it under oath. There's not a word of any of that. I mean, it's very frustrating.
Yeah. Well, I've been talking the last 2 days with Gary Bostwick. I think he's a great guy.
Oh, he's fantastic. He's a rancher. He has a ranch in Wyoming.
You told me
he's a great guy.
You could tell me what you're feeling about his work with you.
Oh, I think Gary's a terrific person, number one, which is very important to me at this stage of the game. Your values change over time, and mine certainly have taken dramatic turns over the last 17 years. But the last 6 or 7 years, I think there's been a real change inside me. And, I think Gary's a real good person and a good friend. I felt very good about his representation of me. There were things I would have done differently at trial. There always are. But that doesn't.
Could you tell me what they were?
Well, I would have brought in more evidence about the new evidence that Joe did not put in the book that tended to prove my innocence.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand Gary's argument very clearly. I'm not deaf, dumb, and blind. I mean, I understand exactly why he didn't do that, but I seriously believe he was wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that it is unimaginable to me, putting myself in the juror's role, to be a juror and not view me differently under two circumstances. One circumstance being we can't discuss a criminal case in 1979 or any evidence tending to prove my innocence. The only thing they know is MacDonald still claims he's innocent. That's one version. And we stick to the contract and fraud issues on the civil trial. The other thing is to discuss the tremendous amount of serious evidence documented from policemen, from polygraphers, from ministers, and from decent, hardworking citizens who have jobs and are not dope fiends that prove my innocence. There was over 37 witnesses. It was presented to Joe McGinnis. It was offered to him while he was writing Fatal Vision, while he was claiming to be my best friend.
Yeah.
And the failure to put that material in the book, and actually even worse, because it was even clearer by the time the movie came out, in plenty of time, by the way, as filming was going on and as scripts were being rewritten, this material was being offered to them over and over and over again. The failure even to put a couple pages in discussing the witnesses and the evidence that points so clearly to my innocence. That's just no jury I believe, in a civil case can look at me the same if they knew the quality and the width and breadth of that evidence, as opposed to discussing only the fraud and breach of contract and being told that here's a convicted triple murderer in prison who happens to claim he's innocent.
Yeah.
Those are two very, very different stories. Now, Gary's theory, I think, would be widely held by good corporate lawyers, good civil attorneys. I think Gary is an excellent attorney. He's very perceptive, and his theory is that people, lawyers, and defendants especially, tend to underestimate the intelligence of a jury. And he says that the jury can separate 1979 from 1987, and in fact, they did. They've
Yeah.
written to me and told me that.
Yeah. I'm going to be meeting with Jackie Berea
Good.
and well, what's his name? Betty Lane,
Fred Brashear.
Fred Brashear
Excellent.
on Friday.
Oh, excellent.
And then I'm also meeting with the dissident.
Okay. Lucille Dillon.
Lucy,
Right.
yeah, but I gathered just a little I talked to the majority that they would have awarded you I forget what the sum was. But
It would vary depending on the person, but anywhere from 90,000 to 500,000 to millions.
Yeah, so they were certainly, if Gary's strategy works with
no
them.
question. That's why I'm saying, and I understand that, I'm the person who is, wrongly convicted, and I'm desperately trying to prove my innocence. But I still knowing that, and knowing that it's hard for me to be objective at this point, I still think that the jury. I'm not sure about Lucille Dillon. Okay, I don't know about Lucille Dillon. I would guess nothing would ever have changed her mind about anything from what she said to the other jurors. But if her mind were changeable, I think it was revolving around not the contract and fraud and breach of contract issues. I think it was exactly my point that her comments to the other jurors were, he's guilty. The book is true. We showed during trial that there were large portions, at least, of the book that were not true. She didn't hear any of that. We did not put on the evidence of the 37 new witnesses and the 4.5-year investigation and all of that stuff that had been lined up to give Joe McGinnis because of the pretrial ruling based on not refighting the 1979 trial.
Also, if you start getting into issues of truth, wouldn't that then make it a libel case? Which
that's the other side of the coin. In this particular case, I think it could have been handled very easily because we did it on other issues. And as a matter of fact, at one point, Judge Ray is the person who framed the question. And that is this material you want introduced material that had been offered to Mr. McGinnis? Was it in the purview of his writing Fatal Vision that this material came out? Was it part of the material that he could have utilized in his research? Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm not talking about material that Joe McGinnis was not aware of and didn't use. In other words, we were basically attacking the quality and the width and breadth of his so-called investigative reporting. In other words, we were saying Joe McGinnis had a contract with me to write a nonfiction book. He assured me over and over and over again that it was going to be well-researched. It turns out, in our opinion, it wasn't well-researched. He sat in first New Jersey and then Massachusetts and wrote a book. And what was it based on? It's based on the government case. He doesn't have in there. Now, he will say, and he said under oath at trial, which is a misstatement, a lie, if you will, that he utilized that information. He didn't utilize that information. He wouldn't talk to Ray Shedlick, my investigator. He never discussed it with Brian O'Neill, my attorney. Never picked up the phone. Brian O'Neill was my attorney from August of 1982. Joe McGinnis and I were still best of friends until June 1st, 1983, when Mike Wallace put the microphone in front of me and told me what Joe McGinnis said.
What a moment.
I've had some devastating moments, but I'll tell you, that was one of them. That was one of the top 5. I didn't believe Mike Wallace. I looked at him and I said, this is, you're putting me on. I don't remember the exact words. I mean, I really don't have a clear memory for that day. But I know I broke out into a sweat and I was looking at him and I said, this is some kind of a bad joke. And I looked over at his producer. And his producer looked at me with these real big sad eyes and shook it. And he was like biting his index knuckle. And was going, it's not a mistake. And I looked back at Mike Wallace and I said, Joe McGinnis, the guy that I've been writing to and who talked to me a couple days ago on the phone, He said, Joe McGinnis says you're a homicidal maniac. I said, I don't believe you. He opens up his briefcase real theatrically. I don't know if it's on the 60 Minutes show that finally hit, but it's in the outtakes for sure. And he opened up his briefcase and picked up a thing, which he never really showed me, but he said, this is the transcript of Fatal Vision. And he started leafing through it. I said, Joe McGinnis said that I'm a homicidal maniac, the man who lived in my house? And he said, yeah. He said, how do you feel about that? And, we went on from there. The next 90 minutes, which are on tape, went downhill from there. He then proceeded to basically go over about either 6 or 8. It was an even number. I think it was 8 points from the book. I thought that it was like a bad dream. Yeah. I kept saying, wait a minute. I abused amphetamines? I mean, Mr. Straight, my friends, I mean, I'm sort of a joke with my friends. I've never used drugs. I mean, and so he says, are you saying to me that you denied amphetamine use? I don't know if he said use or abuse, but the term to me meant abuse. And I said, of course. And then he says, is this your handwriting? And I said, yeah, those are notes I made my lawyers. Doesn't it say here you took amphetamines? So I says, yes, it says over 1 month I took 3 to 5. He says, well, Joe says you were gobbling handfuls, 3 to 5 at a time. I said, well, where does he get that? I said, what do you mean? This is a note that I wrote to my attorney, and Joe McGinnis got it during the research because I gave it to him. And he says, Joe McGinnis says he discovered it, in your files. I said, I gave it to him. What are you talking about? I said, I gave this to him. He said, well, it fits, the pattern of this man gone berserk. I said, wait a second. I said, I was examined at the hospital by 6 physicians, not 1. I said, a psychiatrist came to see me. I said, there are blood and urine tests done on me. I said, how can you possibly say that? He said, well, McGinnis has this theory that the tests that were done weren't proper, weren't able to. I said, wait a second. I said, you mean to tell me that McGinnis has a theory in this book that in what the Army has stated to be the largest investigation they've ever conducted in a triple homicide into an officer's family on post, they didn't do the proper tests? He said, that's right. I said, I don't believe that. You have video? Well, Alan, I said, I said, something's wrong here because that can't possibly be true. Even the CID, for all I know now about the CID, could not have ordered the wrong tests on blood and urine when you asked for drug screening. And of course, we've rechecked, and drug screening is there. The material was there. So they bring into the civil trial this one lab tech who didn't use one machine, and he used another machine, and he says he's the one who did the lab test. Well, we have no way of knowing that. We can find no lab person who can agree with that. I mean, everyone looks at it and says, well, why would they do the wrong test? I don't understand. If you get blood and urine in a triple homicide and you're looking for drugs, why would you use a machine that can't attest for drugs at that amount? It just does, the whole thing doesn't make any sense.
I've been reading Joe's letters to you that are in the exhibit book, and I get the feeling that toward the end you were asking to see the book and he wouldn't show it to you, and right. I wondered whether you were beginning to be a little nervous and suspicious or something.
It wasn't. Yeah, sure, there was some of that, but it wasn't anything like Joe had betrayed me. That isn't what I was fearful of. Yeah. I was fearful of the quality of the portrayal, quite honestly. And that all started in a phone call, a very infamous phone call now as far as the case goes, in late August of 1982. Now, the sequence is conviction occurred in 79. I did a year in prison, 51 weeks actually. Went home on appeal, which was a speedy trial appeal. I'm at home for 18 months. I'm back at work at St. Mary's. I'm a physician. I meet a new girl. We get engaged. 7 days later, March 31st, 1982, 7 days after my engagement party, the Supreme Court overturned my speedy trial win, and I was rearrested that morning at my home by the FBI and brought back to jail. Joe was still my best friend. Andre Pronto aquí. Andre Pronto aquí. that was March 31st. In August, the critical appeal, I mean, there's lots of appeals in the case. I have a list if you'd like to see them, but there are lots of appeals. But it is a very crucial appeal because it was the first time that the Fourth Circuit was looking at trial error. All the other things have been constitutional issues. This was the appeal that everyone, including the prosecutors, knew I couldn't possibly lose. I mean, everyone in this case, including Brian Murtaugh. I mean, he may not say that, but there's no question. When my lawyers would talk with him and the investigators would talk and the body language, there was no way this case couldn't be overturned on Judge Dupree's rulings. We were 0 for 24 at trial, 0 for 24 in major motions. The government filed 8. They got 7 of them. They had 7 yeses on their motions and 1 no. We had 24 straight no's on very legitimate requests to have evidence introduced, witnesses appear, psychiatric testimony, the Colonel Rock report, on and on and on and on. So it just was inconceivable that we couldn't overturn. We got overturned. I mean, I'm sorry, the Fourth Circuit ruled no trial error. That's the one Joe now quotes in the book. And of course, Joe had been writing to me, well, there's no question what's going to happen. Judging from the quality of the oral argument, things look like, you'll be home again soon. Can't wait for that day. We'll be running on the beach, all that stuff. I lose the appeal. I'm here at Terminal Island. It was the same time that I was changing attorneys from Bernard Siegel, which he very badly mishandles in the book, who he mishandles, and the actual changeover to a new attorney badly mishandles. Bernie and I, great friends, have always been great friends for 12 years. Joe handles the entire relationship, 12 unbelievable years. I'm very intense. Many, many ups and downs. Bernie won the case 4 times, and he's a Superman. Not Superman. He's a very good person, a tremendous human being, and we're super friends. And Bernie comes down here. We have like a 2.5-hour meeting, which is a lot of tears, and we agree. We need new directions in the case. He felt somewhat burned out. He felt he had gone to the well too many times. And for whatever reason, everyone in this case now has blinders on, both sides maybe. And I needed a new view. I said, thank you. I said, then I'm going to get another attorney. He gave me some ideas. We talked about some of the hot shots in the legal sphere. And we said that Mike Malley was a good person to go interview some of these people for me. And we left hugging each other. Joe has all of that distilled to one sentence in the book: dismissing his attorney as an asshole. That is Joe's recapitulation of 12 years with Bernie Siegel and 3 tapes among the tapes that I made, Joe, out of the 31 tapes, and probably 5% of the entire 31 tape, if you took all the minutes and added them up, 5% of the times on Bernie Siegel. The good, the bad, the little trouble spots, the great things he did, the wins, and none of it's in the book. He has 1 sentence. Okay, so but I'm getting off track. We're here in August of 1982, and I'm changing attorneys, which is a major, major thing. It's like a divorce. Yeah. Okay, I mean, at that point in my life, that's like your lifeline, and it's a real big thing. And of course, my girlfriend and I had been engaged 7 days, and now I've been in prison from March 31st till August, however many months that is. And she was coming every visiting day possible, but still, she was 21 and I was 38 or so, and 37, I guess. And there was no question. I mean, can't hold on real long under those circumstances. It's just not something made to be. And I knew that. So there's all these pressures. And I called Joe. This is the famous phone call that I was leading up to. And we're talking away, and I said to Joe, we're talking about basically public relations, to be honest, although I'm a little chagrined to say that. We were really talking about public relations, and I was saying, look, Bernie says we need some real powerful stuff on public relations, and the new guy I've been talking to, Brian O'Neill, agrees that there's a critical mass out there, and everyone's starting to get the feeling that all my claims of innocence may not have much validity to them, because if there was validity to my claims, how come these courts keep ruling against you? You can't afford many more losses. So let's get some positive images out there. So I'm talking to Joe. who was always acted like our PR advisor for all these, at that point, 3 years. And he says, well, he says, the best thing I can do, he said, is not get involved in PR. He said, that's not my bag. He said, the best thing that I can do is finish the book that's going to vindicate you. He says, that's the most powerful PR tool you'll have. He said, so you'd be hurting yourself to have me fly out at your expense and meet with your attorneys and investigators and sit in as like a PR consultant. You know, what should we give to someone who's trying to do a good article, and what shouldn't we give to hold for court? He said, that's not really the best role for me. He said, let me finish the book that's going to vindicate you. I said, okay. And there was I'm trying to think of what he was saying at trial, because there was something else that came up in the phone call that it wasn't the point of the phone call, but it did come up in the phone call. He is accurate on one thing he said at trial. It'll come in, it'll pop in, but we were discussing several things. The big thing was PR. So, what did you ask me? I'm sorry, I'm losing my train here a little bit.
About whether you had any
Oh,
inkling of.
okay, all right, that's right. So I called him back either a couple hours later or the next morning. I'm not sure which, and he didn't know either at trial. Neither of us could really remember, but there were two phone calls fairly close together. And I said to him, Joe, listen, something you said bothered me. You know, this business about not wanting to help on the PR. I want to talk to you a little bit about that. I mean, that sort of bothers me. I mean, here you're getting ready to publish a book that's going to help vindicate me. Isn't it? Haven't you been telling me all along that like your publisher's going to start planting seeds and columns, and there'll be little things in Publishers Weekly? He said, oh, yeah, yeah. He says, that's not what I'm talking about. I said, Joe, I don't have anything to worry about, do I? And he said, well, he said, let me put it to you this way, Joe. He said, if there were 100 people in the room and 100 people read the book, there's no question most of them are going to know you're innocent. He said, but there will be some people in the room who won't end up liking you because you do have some warts, which you have always admitted to me. And I said, Joe, no one's perfect. I'm not perfect. I know I have warts, and I presumed he was talking about extramarital affairs in the large majority at that point. And I said, Joe, I've been honest on all that. You've asked me some very tough questions, and I've made some very tough tapes for you. And I would not like that to be the point of the book, but I certainly want you to write an honest book. He says, well, if you want an honest book, you've got nothing to worry about. And he said, believe me, the majority of the people who read this book will understand your innocence, but there will be some people who don't like you. I said, I can live with that.
But he did say that book was going to vindicate you.
Oh, absolutely.
But he must be denying that now.
He says that conversation never occurred as I relay it.
Yeah.
Okay. He says that the conversation was, I said to him, Joe, listen, this book is, he admits that we were talking about PR. He does admit that. And then he says, but he was really wanting like a hard sentence or a hard statement on where the book is going. And Joe says, he said to me, I'm not sure you can count on this book. Fury. That is not what happened at all.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I immediately called my secretary, my partner, Steve Shea, my fiance, Randy Markwith, and my mom, and said, Joe's not going to be out for the major meeting with Brian O'Neill and Bernie Siegel and the investigators, but, you know, no worry about the book. And I explained to them that he is going to focus his energies on getting it out because he believes that the book is the most powerful tool of all. So everyone in the defense team relaxed again. I mean,
tell me, what would you have done? And I think you answered that at the trial, but I'd like to know a little bit more about this. If he had leveled with you, if he had said, well, now I've changed my mind, and after listening to the trial, I agree with the jury, and I think you're guilty, what would you have done then about the book?
it probably would have been aborted because Joe hadn't written a word.
So you would not have talked to him anymore. You would have.
You know, it's very tough to put myself back there.
Yeah.
That's a very tough question because I can't conceive of myself talking to him. but I'm trying to be honest with you. It's a very tough situation to imagine because no one around us, uh, I'm being as frank as I can, my family, my friends, and the defense team couldn't conceive of someone actually burrowing into all the evidence, what's admissible and what's not admissible, what Judge Dupree and what he didn't do, what Judge Dupree did and what he didn't do, what the investigators have done. At that point, I'm not talking about the stuff that came on, which was way more dramatic over the next 2.5, 3 years through Ray Shadlick and Brian O'Neill. I mean, the really dramatic proof of my innocence came later in time for the book. But Joe didn't want anything to do with it then. But even at that point, back in August of 1979, I think that none of us could have conceived that any decent, honorable human being who looks at all the evidence could ever write a truly negative book about the case, the facts against me, so-called facts about a homicide. We all knew, and I knew, I guess to the core by that point, that no one's perfect, and I certainly have my flaws. And this was not a comfortable thing to go through. I've been bared more times than anyone I know or read about. I mean, I've been dissected by psychologists and psychiatrists on the stand and off the stand and in the media more than anyone I've ever read about. It's a very, very bad thing to undergo.
Yeah.
Terrible. Even if the portrayal is decent, it's not at all what people think. To be portrayed in the media, even in a decent manner, is not a good thing. I mean, it took me a long time to come to that, quite honestly. It just not. Your life is not the same. People don't react to you for you anymore. They react to you for publicity. It's a very strange phenomenon to undergo. I'm trying to answer your question. At that point in 79, it never occurred to us, to be quite honest. I mean, they asked me that at trial, and I said that, and Judge Ray looked at me and he smiled at him and just shook his head. But it's the truth. It never occurred to us that someone could really get all the facts laid in front of them who's neutral, which I think is one of the keys of the case, because my opinion has shifted gradually about Joe and when he came to his decision, and written a really negative book. Had he come to me in the first week in September when he came out here to visit with me in Terminal Island, a month after trial, and said, Jeff, I agree with the jury, I think the book would have been aborted. And I think it would have been aborted fairly easily. Joe had nothing done.
Mm-hmm.
He desperately needed me to continue the book. I was the one who opened up my friends and my family and the defense team to him for the only research that we know he truly did was in the next 6 months.
So you do think he couldn't have, because I wondered whether if he wanted to write a book about your guilt, then he could have just talked to the prosecution and done it that way and didn't really need you.
I think,
see what I mean?
Joe sees himself as a literary person, not as a he sees himself a step above the usual journalist who gathers together some facts and writes an article. He had been through that, and he sees himself as having progressed from that. He sees himself as a real artist. If you've seen the transcripts and read some of them carefully, it even comes across on the printed word, and that very often doesn't really tell you the body language in the face like a trial. I mean, he over and over, he kept trying to turn to the jury and say, but I'm an artist. No one has control over me. His message was, I'm really a step over everyone. I mean, you can talk about other things, law and medicine and whatnot, but books and art and the artist are clearly on a different plane, and no one has any controls over them and shouldn't. And he proceeded to call in Wamba and Buckley to say, he's right.
As I was saying to Gary yesterday, it seems to me that you won the case when those guys appeared and
There's no
so
question.
alienated the jury.
I'll tell you what, and the jury, that's exactly correct. If we didn't win it then, and this is actually very, very interesting, if we didn't win it when Buckley and Wamba appeared, we won it when Joe brought in his hired guns, the two so-called doctors, the psychologist and the psychiatrist. The testimony in that situation, there was spar value to Buckley and Wamba. Okay? In other words, although we knew the words they were saying were a little outrageous, and we knew several of the jury members were smiling, and we knew the reaction of some people that we had in the audience. The reaction being, "Oh, that's preposterous. No one's going to believe that a person is supposed to go out and lie and basically tell mistruths to get to the truth." You know, in other words, if you're confronted with a question, you have to answer it truthfully, whether it be Joe Wambaugh, William Buckley, Joe McGinnis, Jeff McDonald, or an investigator or whatever. So they said that was preposterous, but we were still bothered by the star value. I mean, we're not sure how a normal middle-class American reacts looking at William Buckley. Say it's okay for Joe to do what he did. So although it turns out that what you said is true, that we won a large portion of our case that day, when the two hired guns came in, there is no question that we gained ground. When those two men testified as to my psychological and psychiatric profile, never having examined me, never examining anything but Joe McGinnis's book and the tapes that I made to Joe McGinnis, and Joe never explained to them that they were made in prison with guards walking back and forth outside the door. For instance, one of these two men testified that the tone, he listened very carefully, and the tone was monotone and there was no inflections. So my lawyer said, well, that was the first time it struck us. He didn't even know where the tapes were made. And he said to him, do you understand these tapes were made in prison? Well, no, I didn't know that. There's a guard walking up there, and I wasn't supposed to be making tapes. So this judgment and calling me psychopathic and whatnot based on this really tremendously pop psychology type of thinking and armchair psychiatric diagnosis. It was just outrageous. And the jury was very offended. As a matter of fact, I get a strong impression from at least a couple of them that it was very insulting. And they were saying, look, these people think we're really stupid. You know, I mean, this is outrageous. Dr. Samanow, who was sort of the psychologist that Joe McGinnis brought in, he is relatively infamous in the field. To some people, he's famous. To others, he's infamous. He is a person who has really constructed a theory of the criminal personality. And what I'm saying now is no secret. In the prison system, there is a large group of psychologists and psychiatrists who are pro-Samanow and a large group who are anti-Samanow because his theories are very preposterous. I mean, to any academic psychiatrist, for instance, if you went to a person who wasn't attached to a prison system, they'd laugh him out of the room. It is just...
I tried to find this book at the Academy of Medicine in New York, and they don't even have it. I mean, he must be some sort of a pop psychologist.
It's awful. It is awful. The main theory of his book is, I think it's called The Criminal Personality. I believe that's the title, but I'm not sure. And then he has some follow-up books.
It must be a sort of spin-off of that Cleckley book, The Mask of Sanity, which is also, that's another very outdated book.
Exactly. Exactly. And his theory is that he has this unusual perceptive skill. Samanow does. Most doctors, this is really terrifying. I'm serious about this. It's very terrifying to listen and watch this man. Most doctors, most therapists, most nurses, most physicians, most psychologists and psychiatrists can't really pick up on what he can pick up on, but he has done that and laid it out so they can learn from his book. This is what he said at the trial. And he has found in his lengthy investigation into the criminal personality 52 character traits.
Yeah, I read that transcript. I read that part of it, yeah.
Gary took his book, never having seen the book, never saw the book in his life, took the book from the witness stand, opened it up and started reading and started cross-examining on that line. His answers were so ludicrous. For instance, one of the character traits was a belief in God. And the book says very clearly, all criminals have this over literal interpretation of God. God to them is the avenging, sort of bloodthirsty type of God that some of the fundamentalists believe in. So Gary said, where have you discovered this in Dr. MacDonald? And he said, well, see, that's this. Now, Dr. Samanow says, and it's in the transcript, well, see, that's the skill of the sociopath or the psychopath. Because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. Now, I'm jumping ahead, but he did this about several of, Gary picked like the first 4 or 5 traits he ran across. One was the religious thing. One was a fear of death. And Gary very carefully got him to say under oath that yes, every criminal that he's ever examined has every one of the 52 traits. He then proceeded to go over about 5 of them, and I had none of the 5. And he says, well, so far we're 0 for 4, 0 for 5, whatever number they were at that point. And Samanow's answer was, well, that's just simply the fact that other people can't see it in him. The jury, I mean, we thought I was looking at the jury, how would I take it? And they were laughing. And I wrote a note to one of my attorneys, Joanne Horn, Gary's.
Yeah, I met her.
Okay, she's a terrific person. She was trying to keep a straight face, and she wrote back, she said, relax. She said, even the jury, no matter who they are, they're not going to miss this. This is terrific for us. This is awful testimony. Let me tell you something. When the day was over, this particular day was a very bad day. It's tough to sit there and be talked about like this. I mean, it really is. For instance, one of their theories was I have no empathy. So Gary would leaf through the tapes real quickly and read a paragraph, like about my father or about my pets or about my wife or my kids or about anything, and say, doesn't that paragraph have some empathy? No, not at all. Absolutely not. And actually, what you're taking to be as empathy is MacDonald's sociopathic ability to try to let you see that when in fact it's not there. So Gary's the closing was, so if it's there, it's there, and if it's not there, it's still there. And the guy says, well, basically, that's true in this case. And the testimony was ludicrous. So we scored an amazing number of points based on very highly paid. One was $10,000. The other one got, I believe, $2,000 or $4,000 for that day, but he had been getting $200 an hour for his preparation, and his preparation took weeks.
Really, he was the one who read the transcript.
Right.
Or also listened to the tapes, yeah? Yeah.
Yes, right.
This guy stole with the narcissism, yeah.
Exactly.
Which one made a worse impression? The jury, did they?
It's a tough call. I'm not sure I can tell you that. Samanow, the psychologist, comes across worse. But to me, Stone was worse because it must be my bias because he's a physician. And he comes from a legitimate institution, whereas Samanow doesn't. Samanow's studies have always been suspect from day one. No one who's really in the know believes Samanow. But Stone is he's associated with Columbia University.
Yeah.
For him to come on and for money to say these things without having examined me and to intimate that this is what psychiatrists can and do was simply outrageous. Yeah. Dr. Robert Sadoff is a psychiatrist of very high repute. He was a president of the American College of Forensic Psychiatrists. He was one of the first 15 members of the entire board of forensic psychiatry. He examined me in 1970, in 1975, in 76, and in 1979. There were 4 meetings and there were 3 separate exams over time, each time with new psychological testings. On top of that, he reviewed the Army's week. Colonel Rock in 1970, the hearing officer for the Army, under the pushing of the prosecution side, sent me to Walter Reed. I had it was 5 days 1 week and a couple days the next week. It was like more than 1 week of evaluation by a team, including the chief of psychiatry at Walter Reed, 1 or 2 other psychiatrists, and another psychologist. So I've been evaluated extensively by Robert Sadoff and the team at Walter Reed. Then I get evaluated pre-trial by Dr. Seymour Hallett, who's at University of North Carolina and Duke. He's located in Durham. And he's another one of these doctors like Sadoff that you don't buy. In other words, you don't spend $1,000 and get their vote. He's not a person who goes around the country for money testifying for people to make money like Samanow obviously does. Proudly talking about this is his 50th case, and he also testified he's never examined someone in jail who wasn't a criminal. There's no one in jail wrongly, according to Samanow. He testified to that. So we had the evidence of the team from Walter Reed from Sadoff over 9 years with several evaluations and multiple psychological evaluations. And we had Seymour Halleck done in 79 pre-trial. The only evidence that contradicts all of that, which includes, again, a prosecution series for great length, about 10 full days at Walter Reed. The only, not 10, 5 working days, 1 week and a couple, so like 7 days at Walter Reed. The only evidence that contradicts any of that was this totally sham examination by 80-year-old senile Dr. Brussel.
Yeah.
The guy was, this is factual. He was drooling from the corner of his mouth. He was senile. He thought he was in Maryland. He didn't know when he had his hat and coat on. He had to ask, he kept asking for his hat and coat. We kept saying, Dr. Brussel, you have it on. And he kept going, my hat? And he kept hitting his head. He examined me, examined in quotes, for 25 minutes during trial at night in my lawyer's office on the judge's order. The judge said to Judge Dupree, said, if you want to bring into testimony Dr. Robert Sadoff, Dr. Seymour Halleck, and the Walter Reed team, then we have to give the prosecution one more shot. I said no. Bernie said yes. All the lawyers got together and sort of strong-armed me into the office. And I said, Bernie, don't you see a setup coming? He said, well, it may be a setup, but we've got legitimate people, you know. So you got to go through with this because we need the legitimate people to be heard by the jury, even if they bring in some real trash. So I went through this 25-minute interview. The interview consisted of Brussel taking out from his inside pocket in his suit a typed list of questions. There wasn't a single question about my family, me, my sexual identity, my relationships with my mother and father, nothing psychiatric. From 1 to about 30 or 40, every single question involved forensics in the case. I said, Dr. Brussel, I don't understand what you're doing. He says, aha, you're paranoid. I said, Dr. Brussel, listen, let me explain something to you. You seem a little confused. I said, I'm a physician. Now, you don't have to like me, dislike. I don't care. You're evaluating me at trial. But I'm a legitimate physician. I've been to medical school. I'm a good physician. I run a very busy emergency room. What you're doing is not what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be doing a psychiatric evaluation of me. Now, are we going to do that or not? And he says, I'm going to mark this down. He says, this is going to come back. And he writes something down. So I'm looking now, his sidekick, Hirsch Lazar Silverman, the psychologist that he brought with him, who looked a little more legitimate, turns out was of the same type of mind, says to me, don't worry about this. I'll be your witness. He gets a little confused. I'll square him away. Believe it or not, I said, okay. So I answered a couple more questions, about 10 more minutes. And finally I said, look, this is not a psychiatric exam. And I said, we're going to have to get my attorney in here and we're going to have to discuss what's going to happen, or we're going to have to terminate it. It ended up being terminated. Okay. That is the study used by Joe McGinnis in Fatal Vision. That is the only study he refers to. Now there's a lot on psychology and psychiatry in Fatal Vision, but unless you really study it, Joe is very, very clever. Okay, he's a very smart man. I have to give him that. There's about 115 pages on psychology and psychiatry. And the casual reader thinks Joe has covered my examining physicians. That isn't what he did. What Joe did was take segments from the grand jury, never from trial testimony or their reports, in which the prosecutor was asking hypotheticals based on hypotheticals. For instance, Victor Warheide, the prosecutor, would say, Dr. Sadoff, if I were to tell you that the wounds were indeed self-inflicted, and if I were to tell you that no other assailant's presence in that house has ever been proven, would that change your thinking? And Dr. Sadoff said, under oath, well, he says, that's a pretty large amount of ifs. He said, you're asking me to really make some incredible leaps. And he said, well, for the benefit of the grand jury, this is a discussion. We're examining any possibility here. He said, for the benefit of the grand jury, would that? And Sadov said, well, if those conditions were to be met, of course I would have to reevaluate my thing. Joe has in the book Sadov reevaluating his position on me.
Yeah.
When I read it, it is so preposterous. Sadov was sitting in Raleigh, North Carolina, discussing the case with Joe McGinnis. Joe McGinnis met Bob Sadov. He went to his office once afterwards. He went and watched a tape done under hypnosis of me when I was describing the assailants and that night, in which the police artist from the LAPD was doing the police drawings. Joe left the room crying with Bob Sadov, who was also crying. None of that's in the book. What's in the book is this 2-page, absolutely fraudulent non-exam by Brussel done at night, in which they write out a so-called psychotic homicidal maniac is the most that is the piece of information that Judge Dupree used to keep out the 5 legitimate examiners, Halleck, Sadov, and the people from Walter Reed. Everything was kept out because of Dr. Brussel. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about Joe McGinnis, as long as we're on the topic. We're a little bit off what you asked, but it's very important, actually, to the case. A little bit, a while after the book came out, the first firing line was hell. Now, it only occurred to me later, and by reviewing letters, I didn't really recall at that time that William Buckley was an old friend of Joe McGinnis. Okay, turns out he is. They testified to that now, so it's clear now. But back then in '83, I really didn't remember that very clearly. And we heard that Sadov and Halleck, these 2 psychiatrists, were going to be on firing line with Joe McGinnis. So we had a friend tape it, and we eventually got a transcript from the program. And in it, Joe McGinnis is basically talking about the government side of things, and he's using the information from Dr. Brussel. He never describes to Halleck and Sadov any of what I just told you. They think that there has been a psychiatric exam done on me by someone who they don't know. They didn't know Brussel, but that must have been a legitimate psychiatrist. And the whole show is based on this misinformation being given out by Joe McGinnis. And that's the first firing line. The second firing line was post-trial here, when they had Floyd Abrams on.
My feeling when I watched that was that Abrams was definitely not taking McGinnis' side. I thought when he was sort of talking about what juries like, for instance, I thought that he was sort of, oh.
I thought, I only saw the transcript because I see no TV in the hole there. I'm in the hole here, but so I haven't seen TV since July 1st, which may be good. But
just that issue of, about the letters and about,
he was, I did get a sense of he was trying to be somewhat fair in that area, but I thought he was way out of line with some of the things he was saying about the judge and the way the trial was handled. He was being given one side of the case and making that a very, I thought, clear-cut decision that the judge had made a huge error. I don't think it was ever clear. I may be wrong on this, but my recollection of reading that transcript was that it really wasn't clear that this was a contract fight. Okay? Joe kept going back to the First Amendment. Okay? That's Floyd Abrams' specialty. The guy who was sort of pouring gasoline on the fire was Buckley.
Yeah.
And he kept sort of phrasing the question to get the answer he wanted. So if MacDonald were to win, then of course the upper court would probably throw it out based on hidden libel. And Abrams said, well, we would hope so, or something like that. Okay. So it was kind of a setup. So each answer was what Buckley wanted to come out. But I don't think Floyd Abrams was very fair at all to the trial judge, who I think did a monumentally it's a monument to integrity. He was right down the middle.
Yeah.
That's all we've ever asked for, by the way. All we've ever asked for is a fair hearing. I finally got one. Unfortunately, it's in the civil trial and not in the criminal case. But the point is, Judge Ray sat there. and he listened very carefully. He gave both sides. He didn't like excise large portions of the case. He let them have their say, and then he made what seemed to be a very fair ruling each time. For instance, he didn't let me freely bring in evidence about my innocence. I mean, he was very clear on that.
Yeah.
He said, this is a contract fraud and breach of contract case, and we will stick to that issue. I don't want this thing to be red flagged because you have refought a triple homicide case that was decided in 1979. Now, that was very much against me.
Yeah.
We could have gotten some in based on material given to Joe McGinnis, which Gary chose not to do. On Joe's side, he didn't let them fight real vigorously on First Amendment, but in fact, they did argue it anyway at the closing arguments. The jury really heard the argument anyway. And I thought that was fair. They thought it was monumentally unfair. I think if you look at our lawsuit, and if you look at what transpired between Joe and I, there is an issue here that Floyd Abrams is not really clear on. And that is that there was a written contract. Number one. Joe breached that. If nothing else, forget about me as a person, forget about me as a human being, forget about Joe's ethics. In the written contract, Joe had to pay me certain funds. He didn't do that. We wrote to him and we wrote to Sterling Lord many times over 9 months prior to filing the lawsuit. We filed the lawsuit in August of 1984. The book was published in 1983 in September. We spent 9 months from about October of 1983 till August of 84 trying to get the script for the movie changed so it was accurate and the funds due me. Neither of those were forthcoming. Things kept getting worse and worse. We filed a lawsuit. That is not clear to Floyd Abrams. If you look at the firing line transcript, for instance, I think I'm accurate on this. Nowhere in there does Joe say, yeah, I stole 90,000 due him. Actually, it's more than that, but he admits to 90.
Yeah. Well, that's another issue, isn't it?
But that's the breach of contract.
Yeah. Yeah. But it seems to me that the case is sort of divided into that financial question,
Right.
and then the moral and ethical one, right?
It was.
And I think the jury really was more clear about and more interested in, as I am, in morals and ethics rather than
Oh,
the
I
money,
understand
right?
that. No, I understand what I'm saying. I agree with that. I'm more interested in it too. But in law, that lawsuit was filed on several things.
Yeah.
One of those is that Joe withheld funds that were due me by a written contract. That isn't even mentioned when you hear Buckley talk or Floyd Abrams defend Joe McGinnis.
Yeah. I guess probably part of that is not a suppression so much as there's so many cases all over the country of people, feeling that a contract was violated, and that's not what's unusual about this case.
Oh, no, I disagree with you.
Yeah.
I think it is a very pointed move by Joe McGinnis, Kornstein's attorney, and now Buckley, so that people think Joe is this poor artist struggling for a livelihood.
Well, hardly.
Okay, but we couldn't mention, it was their motion that we couldn't mention the insurance company. They're the ones who made that motion, not us.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have told that jury that Joe McGinnis wasn't paying a penny for his own defense because he was poor-mouthing it for those 6 weeks. The time in Los Angeles, the time lost from his work, the money, the cost of this defense. He wasn't paying a penny for that
Right.
defense.
He won that suit to make the
insurer
pay.
covered him.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. But the plaintiff, myself, could not mention that in front of the jury based on a motion by the defendant. They're the ones trying to hide the facts of how this lawsuit is set up. So what I'm saying is, on firing line, here was all this talk about the attack on the integrity of artists. And nowhere does anyone have the courage and the integrity to say, well, wait a minute, Mr. Artist. You were supposed to pay him 33% of the royalties. You didn't do that. His answer, had they said that, would have been, and has been in the past to journalists, oh, I didn't withhold any money until he filed his lawsuit. That's a flat-out lie. We have his accounting, and we have his agent, Sterling Lord's accounting. There is a check for $248,000 that he didn't share with me, and there is a check for $50,000 he didn't share with me, and there is the entire payment from NBC of $130,000, which was paid in December of 1983. These dates are important because we filed the lawsuit in August of 84. He had the NBC $130,000. I'm not talking about the money we're quibbling over.
Yeah.
The side contracts, the money for his so-called second book, which never was, and the his consultant agreement and his character acquisition agreement. All the side monies. I'm not talking about that $70,000. I'm talking about the $130,000 he agrees I was due 40% of. He got that in December of 1983. I never saw a penny of it, not a penny. But he doesn't say any of that because that takes away from this myth of this artist in agony. Joe is not an artist in agony. Joe is a person who uses other people. He uses their pain to make money. I don't. That's not like a normal artistic endeavor. That isn't what a painter does. That isn't what someone in the theater does. Joe is an investigative reporter. He makes money off other people. I happen to be a longer project than some of his other projects.
Yeah. Well, so this is a problem of this kind of work. I do this kind of work too, and this is one of the reasons why I'm interested in it, because I think there is a
But
very deep.
I agree with you, and it's more infuriating to me, and I believe very strongly to Gary Boswick, which is one of the reasons I like him, that the ethics and the morals and what Joe did to me as a person in my family is more important than the money. What I'm trying to say to you, I hope I'm getting across. What I'm saying is they're always coloring the argument. They want us only to talk about artistic integrity and freedom of speech, but there's another part to the lawsuit. In other words, if Joe has to say, "Oh, that's right, I did defraud him of all that money. You're right, I did." Suddenly, Joe's stature isn't quite what it was in that argument anymore.
Seems to me the real problem he has in this lawsuit, where he is very compromised, um, lies in those letters that he
Oh,
wrote you, and I think that's a much
yeah.
more serious problem for him than
See, that's
money.
okay. You know, it was interesting because I'm going to say something that's almost blasphemy. Um, oh, Gary would probably leap on me right now, but there is actually something. Now, I want to say this very carefully so it's not misquoted, okay? There is something to what Joe Wambaugh and Buckley said. I'm not talking about the extreme. Okay, please let me finish because it's real important. I don't want to misstate or be misquoted on this because it's very important. If you took what Joe Wambaugh said on its face value, basically I agree with him because I think what he was really saying, but you have to look so carefully at that transcript. And if you miss a sentence, you miss what I'm saying. What he was really saying was that there are certain times in the relationship when, on a very minor issue, a white lie, or what we knew as kids to be white lies, a lie that doesn't hurt anyone, is not such a bad thing. And in fact, it's probably necessary to really get good stories out. If I were an investigative reporter, I can envision a situation where, to get certain documents and certain sources to keep talking to me, there could be some element of what Joe Wambaugh calls an untruth, and what I used to call as a kid to be a white lie. And Joe Wambaugh defined it. He said it's a statement that's a misstatement of fact, but it hurts no one, and it's not germane to your central core. And he was very careful on that. And actually, so was Buckley, but only in one sentence. And then he realized what he said. He never said it again, but it is in the transcript. And that is that Joe Wambaugh saying and Buckley saying, I would never misstate a major belief, and I would never mislead the subject on a major issue. Now, move from that to sort of Gary's cross-exam. Where is their information coming from, Wambaugh and Buckley? It was coming from Joe McGinnis. Did they read the letters? No. Did they look at the tapes? No. Their only information on this case comes from Joe McGinnis, what he says. And Buckley says even more than that, and so did Joe Wamba, actually, very strongly. It isn't even just what Joe said, it's the work, the book, after it's completed, is bigger than life. It's bigger than me, it's bigger than Joe, it's bigger than both of us together. The book is the important thing because it's the truth. And they weren't understanding what Gary was saying to them. But what if it isn't true? What if what Joe is saying is not true? And what if he got his misinformation through very false pretenses? Okay. So what I'm saying is, I hope I got across, I can envision a situation where the normal, everyday investigative reporter, the guy says, you're going to get this back to me by Friday at 5 o'clock. And you say, sure. And you get it back to him Monday at 2. You had to have it over the weekend. That's an untruth, but you had to have it. Or the guy says, look, you're not going to tell anyone about this, right? And you say no. And you've got to tell your editor. Now that's someone, you've lied to him. You've kept the source going. Or the guy says, um, uh, well, you're talking to a Contra, and he says, you're for the Contras, right? And the guy says, I'm sort of in the middle here. I'm kind of neutral, but I'm certainly sympathetic, to what you're fighting for. Now, the guy may or may not be. It's not really important, in that circumstance. That isn't what Joe McGinnis did. And Joe Wamba and William Buckley either never got to that in their thinking or have just shut it off somehow and totally denied it because of this thing about artists being threatened and nonfiction books actually being threatened down the road, which is ludicrous. I'm not threatening nonfiction books down the road. My point is, if Joe were honest and had showed Joe Wamba and William Buckley the letters and the tapes that I made for Joe, and there was a recounting of some of the phone conversations and the fact that he was in my home and he was asking my girlfriend to dinner and things like this, and he was calling my mom when he had too much to drink, and basically sobbing on her shoulder. My mom. That is a very different thing from a, quote, untruth that harms no one. When Joe is saying to me, I have to get back to writing the book that's going to vindicate you. In 1982, when now the proof at trial and the letters between he and Sterling Lord and he and Morgan Entrekin and he and Ross Claiborne and mainly he and Sterling Lord is clear. By 1982, Joe McGinnis was working with Alfred Kassab and Brian Murtaugh. He felt I was guilty. He wanted me in prison, and his wife testified that the day that I talked to Joe McGinnis from prison after the rearrest in March 31st, so the phone call would actually be in the first week of April, 1982, his wife and Joe both testified that when he's on the phone with me saying, Jeff, I can't wait to get you home. This is awful. We've got a lot of work to do. I'm going to keep plowing ahead on this. He hung up and said, good, I'm glad the bastard's in jail. That's a very different thing than what Wamba and Buckley were saying under oath about this untruth, this little white lie. In other words, Joe did not do a little white lie. Joe defrauded me intentionally and very viciously for 4 years on something that was of monumental importance. We're not talking about whether I'm a Catholic or a Baptist. We're talking about whether I murdered my family or not, and how that impacts me, my appeals, my family, the very good people all around me, my mom, my own family that's left, people at St. Mary's Hospital who helped defend me.
Well, are you saying that it's bad to do what Joe did when it's a big issue like this, but if it's something lesser, then the journalist you feel can?
No. See, that's what I was so afraid of even saying that, because
I do want to get this straight.
okay, the journalist has a duty in my mind. And now it's clear in my mind, now that I've heard the testimony and thought it through not once, but 24 or 25 times, it is clear. The journalist has a duty, basically, to be honest. He can do his job by, he can still do his job being honest. That's the answer to their theory that he can't do his job. What I'm saying is, what I was saying on that whole side issue that I just went into, and I was so afraid to even bring it up, is that I could understand the other happening. It's sort of part of everyday life.
Yeah,
A
so
little,
it's a matter of degree. But
but
then
I'm
that,
not saying that. I'm not saying it's okay for a journalist to routinely lie in his dealings. Not at all. What I'm saying is the guy doesn't return the manuscript Friday, waits till Monday. Okay, everyone can live with that.
no, and you're saying he already knows he's not going to return it unless he needs it. But
Right. And there's no one being hurt.
yeah, yeah,
In other words,
yeah,
Joe was maliciously lying. He was intentionally deceiving me on the most crucial issue possible.
yeah. But that is a big problem that he did tell you these things that were true. But what if he had not said anything? If he had just sort of kept it to himself when he was thinking?
But he was saying it loud and clear by his actions. That's what I'm saying. Oh,
I mean, but my question is, would that have made any difference to you, or would you feel it was just as deceitful for him not to say anything, just to kind of keep his own?
I think it's really hard for me to answer that question because by his actions, his message was so clear.
Mm-hmm. Well, but anyway, just if he had maintained some kind of neutrality and just said, "Well, I'm not going to let you know what I think," by maybe not in so many words, but just like now, you and I are sitting here, you don't know what I'm going to write,
Right.
and I'm not making you any promises, and you have your suspicions.
Oh, I definitely. I mean, to me, pardon me for paranoia, because again, I'm not that kind of a person.
Yeah.
But at this stage of the game, I assume that your cousin knows Nancy Doherty well and happens to be a editor at New Yorker. And they said, "Look, we got to clear this up. Artists are being threatened here." Blah, blah, blah. I mean, these articles don't happen by chance. Larry King show didn't happen by chance. You know, firing line wasn't sort of like they all appeared suddenly by mistake on Sunday morning. In the studio. These things are being actively worked on.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether Gary told you. I don't know Joe McGinnis. I met him twice. I only learned about this case when his lawyer wrote to me and told me about it, and I became interested.
But
And now I'm like, what? What was your question?
why? You mean Kornstein?
Yeah,
Why did he write to you and tell you about the case? You mean to get an article?
I think so.
That's the point. That's what I'm saying. So my
But
fears
that
are
doesn't be, but
justified.
because he wrote to me doesn't mean that I'm already his friend. I mean, I get a lot of mail,
I see.
and
Okay. What you're saying is you mean a lot of people say to you, look, there's a story here, and you're looking into the story from a neutral viewpoint.
yeah, I have no axe to grind here. I'm interested in it because it's my livelihood, and I'm interested in journalistic ethics. And I must say that what grabbed me about it was Kornstein included the testimony of Wambau and Buckling in his letter. I think he sent that letter to many journalists in New York. And I was very struck by that because that doesn't represent the way I work.
Yeah,
I thought it was quite outrageous.
believe me. Now I obviously can't speak for news reporters, but from casual comments I heard from reporters at the trial who weren't even covering the case fairly as from my view. In other words,
Yeah.
I didn't think the reporter was doing a middle of the road job. They were leaning Joe's way. Even those reporters were saying things to me like, "Holy good night. I mean, this guy's outrageous to say something like that. We don't work that way."
Yeah.
Now they belittled Jeff Elliott, who happens to be a writer. He works at a black university college, I guess, university or college in North Carolina, and he's got a fairly impressive curriculum vitae. It's not bestsellers. Most of his books are smaller books. Some are 500-page books, but they're in political science and they're used as texts in a lot of schools. He's a very energetic writer. A lot of it's interview type work, so it's not. Some of it is investigative reporting type work, but he's a master interviewer. He's interviewed people all over the world. Very, very, very impressive list of people that he's interviewed, including presidents and Yasser Arafat and people like that. And boy, they took off after him with this incredible arrogance attached to it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was vicious. It was unbelievable. Jeff Elliott's a very legitimate person, very honorable, and he told us, he testified, first of all, under oath. His testimony is very revealing. But he also told us, he said it was the most outrageous thing he ever heard. He said, of all the people, including, I think it was about 30, I don't want to misstate something. He interviewed a large number of journalists, and he named some investigative journalists who everyone knew in the room. I didn't happen to know the name. But of all the people he'd ever interviewed, not a single one would have ever agreed with what Wambach and Buckley said about the journalist's need to tell untruths to get the story out. I didn't mean to say that I felt there was a need or that it was right. I said that what I'm trying to say is that I can understand it happening, and I would let it go by on minor things. I mean, there's not a federal case based on someone telling a white lie, and I'm sure it happens most days with a lot of reporters. But that is not what Joe McGinnis did.
No.
So, see, then you scare me, though, with a question about is it a matter of degree? Because,
Well, I'm trying to understand
right.
what you mean.
Well, there's a big difference to me, but it's hard to define. Joe McGinnis's conduct is clearly repulsive. I think it's reprehensible. I don't think it's allowable ethically, and it's very immoral. I really believe that deep down inside my core.
Yeah.
It's just incomprehensible to me that any person with a real heart and soul and a mind and who worries about anything about ethics or morals would think that was correct. It's just, and that was Jeff Elliott's response, which was why I was so glad to see him that day when he came to court to testify. I mean, he said, that's outrageous. He said, no one who works legitimately, and they said to him, they cross-examined, what would you do? He said, I'd leave. He said, I'd walk off the book. Yeah. He said, if it came down to the fact that I switched my thinking a month down the road or 2 months down the road or 6 months down the road, I'd go and say, Dr. MacDonald, here's what I think.
Yeah.
You know, and I guess to get back to that question, I probably wouldn't have worked with Joe again. I was trying to be honest when I answered. I'm trying to put myself back to 1979, and we thought everything was fine with Joe. So had he come to me and said, look, I'm not going to ever tell you anything about what I'm doing or how I feel about you or the case. You know, I have my own feelings, and kept it neutral, I'm not sure what we would have done. But all his actions were telling us something loud and clear.
Now you know him better than probably anybody involved in all this, and I wonder whether is it possible that he, you were a very good friend, you were fond
Right.
of him, and obviously he was fond of you. Is it possible that he changed his mind? He somehow became convinced that you were guilty, but he still really liked you, and he just didn't know what to do with it, so he took this kind of weak way out. It wasn't a very brave thing to do. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think there's that possibility. There's a couple possibilities. Let me just run down them real quick because I thought about that a lot, that particular question. One possibility that strikes me as being very likely is that Joe never liked me. And the reason I say that is because the deeper we got into Joe's past and his other writings and his other subjects and people who wrote to us from all over the country, Joe really doesn't like anyone, to be quite honest. I mean, I hate to be an amateur psychologist, but I am at least a physician, and I work in a traumatic environment. I do make some rapid fire decisions sometimes. Now I've had way too long to look at Joe McGinnis and his writings and other people's view of his writings. And Joe really doesn't seem to like anyone. I knew that when I read his book, Heroes. But to be quite honest, I assumed, and he seconded to me, that his natural cynicism and suspicion was being turned towards this false prosecution. In other words, it was his disbelief and his cynicism as this tough Eastern writer, the Philadelphia's version of Jimmy Breslin, you know, who was going to just run amok through the government's false case against me. It was that cynicism and that sharpness and that inability to be deceived that was going to allow him to tell the truth. Okay? We were all believing that back in 79. I don't know anymore, but there are possibilities. One is that Joe came in and never really liked me. Okay? I think when you look at the letters he was writing to other people and what he said to other people and what we've heard now, clearly he didn't like the fact that I'm gregarious and I have a lot of friends. For some reason, that just rubbed him the wrong way. I mean, he just doesn't like the fact that my girlfriends are beautiful or were beautiful at the time. that I was a physician living on the water in Southern California. Some of that seems to grate on this. There's a exposed nerve in Joe. I don't exactly know what it is, but I mean, I don't think you can miss it now when you read his book or you look at the letters that he was writing to other people as opposed to the letters writing to me. I mean, he's referring to really nice people. Sherry Seislov, a woman I was spent 5 years with her, and she's a very lovely, intelligent, decent, um, pure is actually the word I always think of when I think of Sherry. I mean, she's a good person. Everything about her is good. And Joe, he like maligns her in the book very cleverly, not through a word. He doesn't say Sherry is an airhead. But what he does is he always, the 3 or 4 times he puts her in the book, he always puts her in the book as a clinger. She's not a clinger. He always puts her like hanging on my arm at the cocktail party. That wasn't Sherry. Sherry is tall and attractive, but she's her own person. She had her own apartment in New York, and I was living in California for most of this time. She wasn't like a bimbo who hung around. No. And to do that to her is an awful thing to do. And she did nothing but nice thing. I mean, she cooked him meals. She cooked him scampi and sautéed, seafoods whenever he came to the house because he liked seafood. Why he did that to her, I mean, that's awful to do that to people. So what I'm saying is Joe never seems to like anyone. You read his book Heroes and you really get into Joe McGinnis. That's the book that really scared me. That was the only scare I ever had about Joe. And I read it once I was in prison and I went and talked to Joe about it. And he reassured me that was his alcoholic phase. That's when he needed therapy. That's when he was in divorce. That's when he hated his parents most. And that kind of look, that bleak, sort of terribly bleak, I guess, gothic view of life where no one is any good wasn't Joe anymore, and I believe him. So there's that possibility. The next possibility is that what he says happened. And that is that he came in neutrally and gradually came to this negative view. The problem is he's told several views of when he came to his negative view. He says he told a few, 2 or 3, he says on Buckley's TV show, 2 or 3 out of 100 news reporters that he came to his decision at the end of trial. That isn't true.
Yeah.
Almost every interview he held, he was saying that. It wasn't 2 or 3 people. It wasn't, he told the judge and the jury in the trial here that it was like a way to shorten the conversation. It was a shorthand. I mean, when you read the interviews from AP, UPI, Raleigh, Charlotte, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Miami, that it just isn't true. Over a period of months, he was saying this very carefully. That he came to his decision either the day Helena Stokely testified, he says that 2 or 3 times, or the day the jury came in. Okay? But then he says later on that didn't mean anything. He was still wrestling with it. And the problem there is he has all these letters that look genuine to me.
Yeah.
And when you read the letters, and when I read them then, I thought, God, this guy is my best friend. And very clearly.
They're very friendly.
Exactly.
I mean, it sounded that you two had real rapport.
Exactly. But see, there's so much lying that's gone on. It's hard to get to the bottom of this. But if you look at the transcript of the trial carefully, it starts to come out. And things like, it turns out that Joe and I had a meeting with Dan Wigatow, the movie producer in Baltimore. I was going to a medical meeting in Baltimore in 1982. Okay. Joe and Sterling Lord met me in Baltimore to introduce me to Dan Wigatow. They arrived with Dan Wigatow. We had this terrific 1.5 to 2 hours, just like Joe had always been. Arm around me, buying me a drink. I said, Joe, I got to go back and study tonight. We're in the middle of this big medical course at Johns Hopkins. And talking great. The movie was going to be this thing that was going to help vindicate me. It was going to be one of who did I want to portray me? And Joe had already been like telling me about his good friend Robert Redford. So I kiddingly say, well, of course, doesn't everyone want Robert Redford? Now Joe portrays that in the trial, like with this sneer, and of course he wanted Robert Redford to portray him. And everyone's supposed to gasp. Joe's the one who said, how about Robert Redford, using his old friend. So that was in 1982. It was the same as always. The letters around that time are the same as always. And it's only if you look very carefully at the transcript of the trial that as they left me at the train station in Baltimore, and I go back to the hotel and they get on the train to New York, from that moment on, they were trying to sell what eventually came out to be Fatal Vision. My lawyers and I looked at each other during trial at one point. I think it was more Joanne than Gary. I'm not sure. I think it was Joanne. But we looked at each other like sort of a big new admission. And that's pretty early because what came out in Fatal Vision was absolutely horrible. In a sense, it's worse than the book. It's more black and white, really, when you get to the end of the movie. Although the book is awful, and Joe's theories at the end of the book are the worst part of it, some of the book, at least, there's some fact in the book. In the movie, there's no real fact. It's all real trash. So he was working with Wigatow, and Wigatow then testifies under oath that the only versions that ever went around to the companies to be sold were basically the version that eventually came out. Freddie Kassab, the avenging father-in-law, Joe McGinnis, the artist standing back coolly, noting the dart episode at the trial when at Bernie Siegel's birthday party, they were throwing darts at a picture of Brian Murtaugh, and Joe, in both the book and the movie, is standing coolly back watching me throw the darts. And the truth is that Joe was throwing the darts, and Joe bought one of the two pop-up dolls that were one of the prosecutors. And it was a black humor thing. We were relieving pressure at trial, just like you do in an emergency room or a city desk at night. There wasn't anything vicious about it. You know what I'm saying? Bernie Siegel was
Yeah.
50 years old or something, some big birthday, and we had a little birthday party, and everyone had a couple beers, and they put up this picture of Brian Murtaugh, and everyone went around the room and threw a dart once. And everyone was laughing. It wasn't a nasty, vicious, horrible thing. Joe misportrays it in the book and the movie. What I'm saying is those letters, including nice ones, not just the businesslike ones, were considerably after the meeting in Baltimore.
Yeah.
They were after my rearrest in March 31st, 1982. Joe has now testified that when he hung up from that phone call about my rearrest, he turned to his wife and said, "I'm glad the son of a bitch is back in jail. It's where he belongs." But he had just gotten done telling me exactly the opposite. And the letters, if you look at the summer of 82 letters, they're all chronological order. Gary's giving you the right, giving them to you correctly. The summer of 82, those letters are very revealing of what Joe at least wanted me to think. He couldn't wait for me to get home. He tells me specifically, "I hope all future briefings will be at," and he gives a phone number. That phone number is my home phone number. Now, what else am I supposed to be thinking? So what I'm saying is, Joe is telling newsmen when the book comes out that he came to his decision at the time of trial. Joe tells other newsmen and testifies at deposition and at trial that this was an agonizing decision. He couldn't possibly come to a date in his mind when he really believed I was guilty. That's what his testimony is at trial. But he does agree that by late 1982, he was clearly working with Alfred Kassab, my father-in-law, who was obviously and publicly, very much anti-me,
Yeah.
and working with the prosecutor. And he was actively trying to sell a movie that was misportraying me or portraying me as Joe McGinnis eventually wrote about me. So how can you believe any of that?
I remember there was a lot of that correspondence about, trying to fend off Kassab's book
Oh,
and
not
other
just
and
Kassab's.
Keeler's book too.
Bob Keeler's book, Ted Gunderson, my investigator.
Yeah.
Ted Gunderson was the head of the LA FBI office. And this guy is not a lightweight guy. Joe, if you read the book and believe the book, there's like 2 pages on him, and he sounds a little flaky. Ted is a very powerful guy. He was number 5 in the FBI. He ended up running the LA office. He had 800 agents working under him. He's the guy who went after the Black Panthers in the 69-70 thing in New Haven, Connecticut. He was the agent in charge then. A lot of dirty tricks involved in that and stuff, but that's another story. The point is, Ted has a lot of legitimacy to him, which you wouldn't get from the book. Ted wanted to write the story once he had found Helena Stokely and gotten the confessions. And he had many writers coming to him saying, look, I'd love to co-write this story with you. So it wasn't just Freddie Kassab, although that was the first and most obvious one. And Joe is clear. If you read those letters, you can't miss what he's saying in those letters on that.
Yeah.
He then got the same way about Keeler, implying to me, both in the letters and in cursives at the prison here when he visited me, that Keeler was probably negative about me.
Yeah.
Okay. But worst of all was when he stopped my investigator from doing it. My investigator had some potential deals for TV documentaries back then in 82 and 83. And we shut those off. I shut those off on Joe's say-so.
Now, you seem to have really consistently liked him. Is that right?
I did. Yeah, I did. I did.
What was your impression of him when you first met?
With the caveat that I was fighting for my life, and that was my first focus. And that's what a lot of people forget now. It's easy to forget. Joe was not our first focus. I met Joe 1 month prior to trial. 1 month.
Yeah.
I was desperately raising money. I was desperately getting witnesses together. We were interviewing people, taking depositions, running all over the country. You know, we were getting ready for a major, major catastrophe and thinking we could prevent it. Joe comes into my life, and I met him. I liked him. He is glib. When he turns it on, he's very capable of getting you to like him. Very capable. Every one of my friends has said the same thing. The most cynical of all of my friends is my ex-roommate from Princeton, Mike Malley, who was a lawyer, who worked on the case as a friend, overseeing my lawyers.
I hope to talk to him.
Oh, good, good. Critical person. He knows the story. He knows Colette and the kids. He knew our house in Princeton. He knows everything. You know, he's a person who could connect all the different phases. And he is the most business-like person I've ever met. I mean, it's really, everyone said, wow, you want to say, Mike, lighten up, jeez. You know what I mean? He's all business. And he never put his arm around me and said, it's okay. That's not Mike. Mike is always aloof, and it's well, we just have to move on, you know, and it's always business. And he absolutely distrusts and disliked newsmen. He never wanted a newsman on the defense team. He never wanted Joe hanging around. And he was the only person telling us that. He kept saying, this is crazy.
And had he met Joe and he felt, no, just
he met him, and about a week later, everything was fine. He was running with us, Mike Malley, Joe McGinnis, and me. The three of us, three musketeers. Sharing drinks. We'd pick up Joe's laundry and pay for it at the laundry. Joe ate all his meals with us. We heard about his affairs. He told me personally about affairs he was having. Michael Malley, there were a couple turning points for Mike, and one of them was Joe signing the work agreement. I think if you look at things that Joe did that are clearly disreputable, I mean, you know, a lot of people, I think, would excuse a lot of Joe's behavior as being an investigative journalist. But there are some things that no one can excuse. No one. Signing the work agreement to be a member of the defense team and guaranteeing in writing not to release anything until he had written approval of Bernard Siegel and myself. I mean, that's monumental. William Buckley never did that to anyone. Joe Wambach never did. They don't even know that happened. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
They're making this decision about Joe and him being so. Oh, what that? Painting, I guess. It's a paint sprayer. They're making it. They don't know any of this happened. Joe signed a work agreement on July 16th that he was part of the defense team to have access to all his data, and that none of it could ever be divulged. He then proceeded to work with Freddie Kassab and Brian Merton, my prosecutor. I mean, that's cut and dry. You should have seen Judge Ray when that happened. When that came out at trial, Judge Ray, who's very calm, was sitting there like this. And when Joe said, like, yes, he said, excuse me. He said, you signed a work agreement with the defense team? And Joe said, yes, I did, Your Honor. And Judge Ray went,